Welcome to the screencast, Perfect Punctuation. This is part 1 of 1, Sentence Structure. This is a graduate writing workshop from the University of Saskatchewan. My name is Heather McWhinney, and I'm Graduate Writing Help Specialist with Student Learning Services. Here are the learning outcomes for part 1 of this presentation. By the end of it, you should be able to recognize the difference between independent and dependent clauses and know how to punctuate independent and dependent clauses. And here's a brief overview of the screencast. First, we'll define punctuation, then we'll explain the structure of independent clauses. From there, we'll review simple and compound sentences and look at their punctuation. And we'll explain the structure of dependent clauses and the function of subordinate conjunctions and relative pronouns. Finally, we'll review complex sentences and their punctuation. Well, how can we define punctuation? Lynn Truss has written an excellent book called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, the Zero Tolerance Approach to Punctuation. And she defines punctuation as a system of printer's marks that have aided the clarity of the written word for the past half millennium. In other words, since the invention of the printing press. And Truss also calls punctuation marks the traffic signals of language. And she's using this term traffic signals to explain that punctuation marks signals to the reader when they're supposed to pause, when they're supposed to go right through, say go right through the green light, when they're supposed to stop. And in this way, punctuation marks are like traffic signals. These traffic signals also have a lot to do with meaning, and we're going to see that on this next slide. So let's look and see if punctuation marks can change meaning. In the left column on this slide, I have some sentences, 4 sentences. In the right column, those sentences are repeated with just a few punctuation changes. And let's look and see how those punctuation additions or subtractions in the second column, if they change meaning. Okay, the first one. Woman without her man is nothing. And the second one. Woman without her man is nothing. Totally different meaning, isn't it? We've just added the colon here and the comma, and we have really the opposite meaning from the first sentence. So here you can see that punctuation marks can and do change meaning. The second one, let's eat, Grandma. And let's eat, Grandma. So having the comma in the first one changes the meaning entirely. And the next one, the giant panda eats, shoots, and leaves. As opposed to the one on the right, the giant panda eats, shoots, and leaves. So what's the difference here? We have a comma in this one, we don't have a comma in this one. Well, the comma here signals to the reader that these 3 words are verbs. Eats, the panda eats, a verb, shoots, a verb, and leaves is a verb, a list of verbs. In this one, because there's no comma, we know that shoots is a direct object, and so is leaves. And so shoots then, in this sentence, is a noun. Both shoots and leaves are nouns, and they have totally different meanings from the way shoots is used in this sentence and leaves is used in this sentence. So here we have shoots meaning those little green parts of plants and leaves as parts of plants. So this is about the giant panda's eating habits. and eating preferences, and this one's about the giant panda's actions. All right, the next one, the last one. Several prominent people were invited to speak, including human rights advocates Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Okay, let's see on the other side. Several prominent people were invited to speak, including human rights advocates Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So here we have one comma, here we have two. But the addition of the second comma changes the meaning completely. Well, at least it clarifies the meaning, because in this one here, this is a little bit ambiguous. We're not really sure whether the human rights advocates invited to speak actually are Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, or if Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have been invited to speak alongside the advocates. Where in this one, it's very clear that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are not the human rights advocates, that they've been invited to speak alongside the advocates. So, and that the addition of the second comma accomplishes that. So you can see then punctuation really matters in your writing because punctuation helps the reader to understand what you are saying. But before we can actually understand these printers' marks or traffic signals, we have to refresh our knowledge of English sentence structure. So the next few slides focus on clauses. Clauses are the building blocks of sentences. So a clause, what is a clause? A clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb. And there are two types. There are independent clauses and dependent clauses. Let's first look at independent clauses and simple sentences. An independent clause is a group of words that expresses a complete thought and that can therefore stand alone as a sentence. So an independent clause then contains one or more subject and verb. It may also, but not necessarily, have an object, a complement, or a phrase as well, or multiple objects, complements, and phrases. Here's an example of different independent clauses here. And so a single independent clause is also known as a simple sentence. So these three examples are all simple sentences. Claire applied to 2 universities. So we have the subject Claire, the verb applied, and we have the phrase to 2 universities. We have the second one. In February, Claire applied to the 2 universities of her choice. So here again we have the subject Claire, verb applied, and we have 3 phrases. In February, to the 2 universities of her choice. In the last one, I'll read it out. By choosing to study nursing, Claire is continuing a family tradition. So here we have, again, the subject, Claire. We have the verb is continuing. And here's a direct object, a family tradition. And then we have a phrase at the beginning of the sentence, by choosing to study nursing. And we know that's a phrase, not a clause, because it doesn't have a subject and it doesn't have a complete verb. So this is just a phrase coming before the subject. And even though it's a longer sentence, the more to it, it's still a simple sentence. And where punctuation comes into play is when those independent clauses are joined to form compound sentences. So a compound sentence then is 2, or actually could be more, 2 or more independent clauses joined in one of 3 ways. With a comma followed by a coordinating conjunction. And the mnemonic I use for the 7 coordinating conjunctions is fanboys. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. If you can remember the mnemonic fanboys, you'll remember all 7 coordinating conjunctions. And when you join 2 independent clauses with a fanboy, you need a comma before the fanboy. So the sea was calm, but Jim was worried about a storm. One independent clause, the fanboy or coordinating conjunction preceded by a comma, and the second independent clause. So that's one way of joining two independent clauses and forming a compound sentence. Second, you can use a semicolon followed by a conjunctive adverb or adverb phrase. Here are some examples. However, therefore, additionally, conversely, in contrast. And then you put a comma after the adverb. So here's an example. Independent clause, the sea was calm. Here's your conjunctive adverb. Here's your semicolon. Here's your conjunctive adverb. And there's your comma. Jim was worried about a storm, your second independent clause. So that's the second way of creating a compound sentence. Your third way is just with a semicolon alone. The sea was becoming rough, one independent clause. Jim was worried about a storm, the second joined with a semicolon. So sometimes students ask me if they could put a period before however and make this a capital. Well, of course you could do that, but if you do that, you don't have a compound sentence. You have two simple sentences. And one ends with a period and the other starts with a capital letter. But if you're going to create a compound sentence, there are only three ways of doing it. With a coordinating conjunction preceded by a comma, with a semicolon followed by a conjunctive adverb or phrase, and then by a comma, or with a semicolon alone. Here are some examples of conjunctive adverbs and adverb phrases. These are ones that are commonly used in writing. Additionally, in addition, as well, furthermore, moreover, besides. These words all indicate addition. In the second one, in the second column, these words indicate a change of idea or contrast. However, conversely, nevertheless, nonetheless, on the other hand, in contrast. And in the final column, we have adverbs and adverb phrases that indicate cause and effect or result. Therefore, thus, as a result, consequently, for this reason, hence. Now let's talk about dependent clauses. They're different from independent clauses. A dependent clause is a group of words that has one or more subject and verb, and it differs from an independent clause in that it begins with a subordinate conjunction. A dependent clause can't stand alone as a sentence because it doesn't express a complete thought. And it doesn't express a complete thought because it begins with a subordinate conjunction. And a dependent clause must be joined to an independent clause to form a complete sentence. And it's joined either with a comma or without a comma. So here's an example of a dependent clause. Although she would like to go home, there's your dependent clause. And in this case, it's joined to an independent clause. Yi is staying in Saskatoon this summer. So you can see that when the dependent clause precedes the independent clause, then there's a comma between the two clauses. The other example, Yi isn't going home because she has to work on her dissertation. So here the dependent clause is at the end of the sentence, because she has to work on her dissertation. And there's no comma. Usually when a dependent clause follows an independent clause, there's no need to insert a comma. And there are a few exceptions. We'll look at those when we talk about comma rules. Here's an example of subordinate conjunctions that begin dependent clauses. After, although, as, because, before, if, in order that, since, that, though, unless, until. And then W words, when, whenever, where, whereas, whether, while. This is just a sampling of subordinate conjunctions. Now I want to talk a bit about relative pronouns and adverbs, because a dependent clause can also be joined to an independent clause with a relative pronoun or adverb, not only with a subordinate conjunction. The relative pronouns are who, whom, whose, that, and which, and the relative adverbs are when, where, and why. So let's have a look at how these dependent clauses work in a sentence. Jim looked at the rough sea, which was beginning to worry him. Okay, so in this example, which is the relative pronoun. And notice that with a dependent clause beginning with a relative pronoun or adverb, the pronoun or adverb replaces the noun. It has an antecedent. In this case, it's replacing rough sea. Rough sea is the antecedent for which. And the next sentence, the cove where the boat was anchored was sheltered from the wind. So in this case, where is a relative adverb, and it is replacing the word cove. And in the last example here, Jim, who is a physics professor, adores being on his boat. Who replaces Jim. Who is a relative pronoun, and the antecedent is Jim. So you can see there's a slightly relative pronouns and adverbs are used slightly differently than subordinate conjunctions in that they do replace an antecedent or a noun that precedes them. And notice as well that those dependent clauses starting with a relative pronoun and an adverb cannot stand alone. They have to be joined to an independent clause. Whether you use a comma or not with this type of dependent clause, there are certain rules governing whether or not you use a comma. We'll look at those when we look at comma rules. So what about complex sentences? What's a complex sentence? Well, it's a sentence that consists of an independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So in fact, what we've just been looking at, these are complex sentences. And a dependent clause can appear at the beginning, middle, or end of the sentence. So let's look at these examples. Although Jane likes sailing on clear days, she usually prefers being on solid ground. So your dependent clause here is although Jane likes sailing on clear days, joined to your independent clause. Jane agreed to get married on a boat because she wanted an adventure. Here your dependent clause is because she wanted an adventure, and here's your independent clause at the beginning. Last one, she promised her parents that she would send them a message every day while she was at sea. So here we have that she would send them a message is one dependent clause. That she would send them a message every day is one, and while she was at sea is a second dependent clause. Both are joined to the independent clause. She promised her parents. So that's just a brief review then of simple, compound, and complex sentences, and they are all punctuated a little differently, which is why I wanted to review the sentence structure of these sentences. So just a few final tips before we move on to comma rules in part 2. Leave yourself enough time to revise and edit your work. Make a list of the punctuation marks you know you have trouble with and watch for them specifically when you proofread. Use a good handbook and look up rules even if you think you know them. And I would try looking at websites. Experiment with them and see which ones you like. Here actually I've said 3. Here are 4 actually that I like. This one here, the Grammar Girl website, is very good. The English Purdue OWL website. It's a grammar one that I like, and this is the teacher's guide for eats, shoots, and leaves, which is actually quite good. So hopefully those are helpful, and you'll find the link, live link in the PowerPoint presentation. So to sum up, effective punctuation helps your readers to understand your meaning. To understand how to punctuate effectively, you need to understand basic English sentence structure. An independent clause is a group of words that expresses a complete thought. It contains one or more subject and verb. A dependent clause is a group of words that contains at least one subject and verb and begins with a subordinate conjunction. Might also begin with a relative pronoun. The three main sentence types are simple, compound, and complex.